The STEVE Fund is a national organization dedicated to the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color and works in partnership with leaders in higher education. If you've just tuned in, I'm Dr. Jeanne Manese. I'm one of the national advisors for the STEVE Fund, and we work in partnership with higher education, the corporate sector, other nonprofits, and with community partners to promote the mental health and well-being of young people of color. Our series, Community Conversations, is open to the public and an opportunity to meet with mental health specialists, researchers, leaders of color to learn and discuss timely topics and to build community so we can together promote the mental health and well-being of young people of color. Today's event will run for 1 hour. We invite you to share your thoughts, experience, and responses in different ways throughout our hour together in the chat. Be aware, as I mentioned, that today's event is being recorded and may be shared in full or in part with others who could not make this event today. And if you have a comment or question but wish to remain anonymous, we want this to be a safe space. So you can feel free to private chat Steve Fund producer, that's our Sarah, who is monitoring the private chat and will share your questions or comments with us. Again, this is a safe space and we're glad you're here. So let's get started. After today's community conversation, you will be able to define racial trauma and highlight principles of trauma-informed care, discuss resistance and resilience, experience healing and self-care from both individual and community perspectives, and list a set of approaches, resources, and tools to support mental health during the return to campus. So joining me today is my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jessica Ortega. Dr. Ortega is a licensed counseling psychologist at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Dr. Ortega.
Thank you for the warm welcome. Hello, everybody. I see all the places you're coming from. This is amazing. And thank you, Dr. Manese. A little introduction. My name is Jessica Ortega, and I like to give a little bit of a personal history before I jump into the professional briefly. But I come from a humble place of Arizona. I was born and raised by a pretty amazing mom. I'm the oldest of 5, and some of my background, my family has ancestry in Mexico, and on both sides of the family, actually. And I self-identify as Latina. Pronouns she, her, hers, a woman of color. I love the work that I do as a psychologist. I've been working at the counseling center at a university counseling center for the past 16 years and been in the higher education work for 20 plus years. And I'm just so passionate about social justice work and really about self-preservation and really encouraging our students, but also all those that I work with to tap into that personal narrative, because we lead by narrative. And so I'm so excited to be here and to spend time with all of you. So that's just a little bit about myself.
So I'll just add a little bit more. My father immigrated from the Philippines, married my mom, who was born and raised in Hawaii. They eventually moved to a small border town where I was raised in San Diego. And today we see on the screen that we want to make sure that we pay our respect to the elders. And this is one of both Dr. Ortega and my mentors, the father of Black psychology, Dr. Joe White. And we want to pay our respect to all the individuals out there and the 7 generations to come. And these are some of the students that I've mentored who are now leaders. In fact, Dr. Jessica Ortega was a graduate intern,
That's right,
up-and-coming counseling psychologist, and whoo, how the time has flown. So I guess we are going on to the next slide. And so as we think about back to school, we are thinking about things like racial trauma and self-care. And we know that to address this, we will look inside ourselves, but we're also going to look outside to the community and the
Mhm.
society that surrounds us.
Absolutely. And so what we wanted to do is really set the foundation. I think for those of you that do some of this work in higher ed, we realize too, some of you might be students, maybe families, parents, whatever the case may be. We want to create a safe space and have a foundation of comfort for all of you. And so we want you to take what you need. If there's something you don't need, or if you need to step away at any time, that is something you can do. We want to encourage you to do that for yourselves. When we say call in, not out, it's really just learning to be in the space to listen, to understand. We all come from different backgrounds. We have different stories, different generations in this space, not all from the same country or background, whatever that may be. And so we really want to listen to understand, and hopefully there's something you take away from this time and take it back to your respective spaces and kind of continue the dialogue. But we'd also like to invite anyone to add anything else to the chat that would allow you to feel this is a safe space. As we mentioned, we're going to be using the chat box. If something needs to be privately sent, please send to our amazing Sarah, the C-Fund producer. But please feel free to add to the chat, or if you would like to unmute, just if there's anything else you would add that would allow this space to feel inclusive and you feel seen and heard. So feel free to do that. So as we move along, it's important for us to be intentional about our time together. And so we put this slide here just to really indicate being activated by anything that we listen to or see. We know that we're surrounded by a lot of things in our environment, and certainly the past year and a half has activated us in different ways. So some of the slides that we are sharing might be activating motions maybe from the past, or something that's renewed, or it's new. And so we want you to attend to yourself, take care of yourself. So if there's anything activated emotionally for you, you have that place inside of yourself to step away. If you need to mute, please feel free to do so. Just take what you need. And we want you to know this space is really a conversational space. So you'll find that Dr. Manese and I will also be transparent and oftentimes sharing our own experiences throughout this time. Because we feel that when we share contact, we need to ground it in transparency and authenticity. So again, just take care of yourselves. And also a little highlight would be that some of the content we're going to be talking about is related to racial trauma, some oppression, what is social injustice, racial injustice. And so we want to be able to be mindful of that. But that's something I wanted to share with all of you. Thank you. So with that, we're moving into what is racial trauma. Now I want to highlight, you could talk about this particular area extensively in our brief time. We're just going to scratch the surface, but we want to indicate that this is something that embodies so many different experiences. So when someone hears the words racial trauma, for anyone in this space, it might be something different. It might mean something different for you based on your own story, your experiences. For some, it might be any one of these. It might be discrimination. It might be incarceration. When we think of separation, I think of sometimes our immigrant families. I think of a lot of the students I work with that are undocumented or coming from marginalized communities or carry different identities, multiple identities, and how might that impact them? And then also their persistence in school. Is there anything else you would add, Jeanne, to this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ortega. And I just wanted to add, while I am not an immigrant, having grown up near the border, and coming from being a child of an immigrant, I bear witness to the discrimination he faced, the discrimination that I see, the invisibility, and the trauma. And I just wanted to say, in bearing witness and in our empathy, that vicarious trauma also hits deeply. And so in my own bones, I have felt that of my forefathers and foremothers. I have felt my own experience of being harassed and the microaggressions, the racism that often come with racial profiling. Not always was I even racially profiled correctly because I live near the border.
Yes.
And being AAPI, many times people mistook me for being Mexican. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, these are all my sisters and brothers. And so in that, we feel things that not only that happens to us directly, but happens to our family and the people that we love.
Absolutely. And just a little highlight, I think, as a psychologist and the students I have the honor and privilege to work with, the stories they bring into my space. When I think of the vicarious trauma piece, Dr. Manese, I think of some of those moments that they're carrying and how do I serve as an agent of change? And it reminds me of psychology, and my role as a psychologist is not just in the room. It's that advocacy that we do outside the space, and this we'll talk a little bit more about how do we actively engage when our students are feeling or experiencing any form of trauma, and how do we help them access those resources. So thank you. Next slide. And when we're speaking about racial trauma, we realize trauma comes in different forms. We're highlighting racial trauma, but there's different forms of trauma. And so in the work that we do and as psychologists, we want to create a space of trauma-informed care. However, realizing not all of us in this space are psychologists or healers or therapists. You might be students yourselves, family members, parents, caregivers. And so how can any one of us create a trauma-informed space? And so these are some of the highlighted areas that we like to attend to when we're creating a space so someone can truly be their authentic selves and share their story. So one of the areas is safety. When we think of safety, we think of, yes, physical safety, but also creating and cultivating a space of comfort, allowing them to feel that they can be who they are in that space, feeling seen and heard. Sometimes for me, it means walking into that space and saying, what do you need from this space today? How might we pace this to be comfortable for you? For some of you that might be students, it might be just, where can I find my safety? Where are my people? Where is my safety net on my campus where I can feel that? Now, for me, I work in a counseling center, but it might not always be a counseling center. It might be somewhere else where your identities are seen and heard. Choice. I oftentimes have conversations with my students about choice, that they have a choice in terms of where they want to access support. So if I'm operating in my setting, as a therapist, I want to know that they know their options and that they have agency. And that kind of leads to the bottom part, but just empowerment. We always want to empower our students to feel that they're seen at all times. I mean, this last year and a half has shown us a lot of things. And sometimes there's things we didn't want to see, but we needed to see. And so really having that honest humility engagement with that student is really powerful. And then the connection, creating community. You're going to hear us talk a lot about how do you connect. And so in my language, comunidad, community, how do you create that community? How do you access support? As you heard, Dr. Manese was one of my many mentors that I met. And as a first gen, if anyone's first gen in the house, it's really hard to navigate a system that you don't have a recipe for. And so you're kind of thrown in. And for me, I was kind of like pulling my mom and like kind of helping me navigate a system that also she didn't understand. And so how can we be those bridges and those conduits for our students so they feel seen and they can feel that connection to someone that gets it? Trustworthiness, that's that piece of rapport and kind of being who you are. I know I usually lead with story with a lot of my students because they want to feel connected to me, because they might just see the degree. They just might see some other layers of what they think I am or who I am in my identities. But it's important for me to tell them where I come from, what that story has looked like as a first gen student, as a woman of color. What does that look like to navigate a system that doesn't always make sense for us? And so when our students are on campus and there's some protests about particular injustices, how am I partnering with them? Those are some of those areas of trauma-informed care as well. And so it also comes into that place of empowerment and allowing them to see that they have strengths, they have gifts, and that they're worthy to be on that campus to learn and stretch. Thank you. Next slide. So what we wanted to do is just take this moment, a brief moment, and really highlighting that piece of the last year and a half and growing has been a difficult year for people for different reasons. We know there was a pandemic, there's still some things going on right now. Quarantining was happening, racial injustices were occurring, have been occurring before. They have been there before, but for folks that have been re-traumatized during this experience or traumatized maybe for that first time, understanding oppression in different ways and privileges that folks have and don't have. There's been a lot of things that have been happening, but we also recognize losses have happened. And it could be losses of people, it could be losses of things, circumstances. So we just want to have this moment. And if you want to put anything in the chat, feel free, but we would just like to name, whether it be that person or that experience, whatever that was that you felt a loss from or something you have lost. Feel free to give it voice in this space. Or if you don't want to share it in the chat, you can certainly just kind of call it out in yourself to give that honor and that authenticity and honoring of that person. So if you would like to do that, feel free to name and honor at this moment. Thank you, Philip.
I'm touched, so touched by what people are saying. And I hope that today you have a way to feel our heartfelt support and have an experience of healing, because it is healing, at least for me, to be connected with all of you.
Yes.
So thank you so much for this community.
I'm feeling grateful right now. Thank you, everybody. Melissa, Sharon, thank you. Loss of hope. Thank you. I see you. I hear you. Thank you.
We feel you.
Last rites for family. Lots of losses. Yet in the midst of loss, it's interesting that all of us in different ways having to still persist in some way, right? Whether it be through employment. I know there's been employment loss or shifting. I call it shape shifting. If you have like children and family or other caregivers in the home, or just you're sharing small spaces. I know some of my students having to return home and their identities were shifting, where they were helping with their siblings and cooking and helping with employment while still trying to learn and wanting to still be out there protesting and be out there advocating. And so thank you for sharing all of these. Thank you.
So next slide. So we recognize that with all that's gone on, self-care is taking care of your mind, body, and soul. Health is that balance and relationship. And as a person of color, one aspect of self-care is resistance. Next slide, please. So how are self-care and resistance related? Of course, we all know that Audre Lorde paved the way with all her beautiful writings, but I'll just go over this in my own words. So self-care includes the mind, body, and soul decisions people as individuals and communities make for themselves and their families to ensure they are healthy and thriving. Self-care is a means of survival. Yes, we are still here. And it's a means of preservation, not a luxury. And self-care can be an act of resistance because we are living and surviving in the midst of a lot of scrutiny as a person who has been marginalized. And living and surviving is a radical act. It's a radical act for us to stand up and take care of ourselves, recognizing that there are root problems out there that need social change that we confront daily. So resistance is to resist to comply, to resist to accept, to protest what is unjust. And in this context, the resistance refers to the refusal to accept the marginalization for those in power, or in other words, to empower ourselves or others to act with self-determination, to decide our own pathway, our own self-identity, and to have what is just.
So self-care is resilience. Next slide, please. We want to remind you too, when we're talking about resilience, sometimes when we're going through things and there's sometimes this expectation, we just need to bounce back and somehow push through. Some of us may have learned some of those mantras growing up, and even culturally, we may have learned to just kind of press on and deal with it. Maybe because some of the generations that came before us may have felt that they had it harder, and rightfully so, as our ancestors did. When we think of resilience, it's just calling it out. It's naming it. It's allowing ourselves to feel things. When I feel my role as a therapist and I'm working with my amazing students, I'm wanting them to just name it. Sometimes they can't name it because sometimes we've learned over time, I need to just push through and it's going to get better. And then we behaviorally just kind of activate ourselves and get busy with things. But oftentimes we're not acknowledging that pain, that hurt. And then sometimes that waxing and waning numbness, like sometimes we just don't feel anything. And it's hard to feel because it's been hurting so badly. And so we encourage you to think of resilience as that space of strength for you to honor what you're feeling, to acknowledge it, to give it voice. And so I love this quote: resilience is very different than being numb. Resilience means you experience, you feel, you fail, you hurt, you fall, but you keep going. So next slide. So some highlights of resilience. Yeah, if it was easy just to bounce back, I think we would. Some of us have other circumstances, contexts, other traumas that we've experienced throughout our life that we're still navigating. And so resilience, we think of, we want to encourage support. Now, the primary factor in resilience is having a caring and supportive relationships. Not all folks have that access. Not all people have that connection. Sometimes it can feel like a privilege when you see other people have the two parents or two caregivers and multiple siblings and just a field of supporters, and others, don't have that. But we can curate that support system. Relationships can create the love and the trust that we need. So when we're navigating pain and navigating the hurt and the traumas that we've experienced, that will ground us. Those people can help us pull us out. So I think of Dr. Manese and other mentors I've had when I was going through grad school, and some of the things that I felt that was oppressive, I felt like I could be myself and just unpack with them and still feel that it was navigating my goals. So other factors associated with resilience is those plans. Like all of us have different goals in our lives, personal or professional. How are we carrying them out? How are we holding ourselves accountable? But sometimes it's the support system that helps us with that. We're not feeling at our best. A positive view of ourself is key. So of course, as a psychologist, we want positive and affirming self-talk. Not so easy for everybody. It's easy to say, just be positive. However, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of intentionality every day to acknowledge who we are, to acknowledge our strengths and our gifts and who we are as people, and know that we all have divine plans for ourselves. And so that kind of goes to the skills and communication. Learning a lot when I went through grad school and then as a psychologist, that some of these things I didn't really know until I was really learning them. And so learning the art of saying no when we're feeling we're really packed, but we feel the pressures that no, I need to, because these are the expectations. And so if you're a person of color in particular, and you feel you're carrying a bit more because maybe you're the only person on staff, maybe the only person in your class that looks like you, that reflects where you come from, it may feel like you can't say no. And so it's learning how to communicate what your needs are and acknowledging them first. And the capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses. This is really reflective of over time, if we're not acknowledging our feelings. Has anyone in this space ever had that feeling where it's bubbling up and then it kind of just gives you this low tolerance for folks or people or emotions, right? So it's learning how to manage those strong emotions, naming them, and if you don't name them, finding new ways to channel them so they're acknowledged. Next slide.
So as we know, resistance and resilience often comes because we have obstacles, but we are finding those pathways around obstacles. And so one of those pathways is community and connection. And so again, to connect with all of you today is inspiring for me, is healing for me. Being in community is both protective and healing. Next slide. And so I wanted to share a little bit. I I'm calling out to my ancestors that came to the land of Hawaii, and that is where I live now. Um, and we have a saying, and it's different language in probably your culture, but maybe you have the same saying. And part of that is ma lama aina, malama pono, caring for the land and the people, the rightness of balance. So the root word of lama is light or torch, and it is righteous, it is proper to take care. So we take care of the land, we take care of our body, our soul, we take care of one another. And my experience has been that as people of color, our cultures and our people have survived and thrived become of, because of this. And I know Dr. Ortega comes from some of the same communities and some of the different ones. And so do you just want to add maybe your Latinx perspective?
Well, I think yes. So thank you, Jeannie. Thank you. So I said the word earlier, comunidad, and for others, it could be a different word. And community for me was the key to thriving. And I think it definitely stems from, so there's a lot of cultural values I hold on to. Familismo, so family, personalismo, that's kind of that energy of connection. I oftentimes engage a lot with my clients and my students in that, just getting to know them. And before I even start into the therapeutic approach, but coming from those cultural values, respeto, respecting my elders, coming in to listen, to learn. I remember being that early psychologist and I wanted to absorb everything I was learning, but I was really mindful of respecting the group, the setting, my elders in that space. And so that stems from my upbringing. I feel like family was always the root of where I came from. And that's where I took everything in my role. So when I was going through grad school, how do I seek family, an academic familia? How do I connect? And so when I got my first job, I was looking around, and as I was the only Latina identified or Latino identified psychologist at the time, and I remember trying to navigate the campus and trying to kind of locate folks that, you know, may have came from similar backgrounds. So we just kind of connect over food. And so there's kind of the connection over just kind of breaking bread together, and meeting folks on campus, whether it be faculty, their professors or staff, and just creating that moment together. But what I was doing was also creating pipelines. When I think of mental health and students of color, pipelines are very imperative to understanding how mental health is, what it is not, that we have to look at it from multiple dimensions, and access to mental health services doesn't look the same for everybody. And so as a Latina, like when I was going through college, I was not aware of a counseling center. And I went to a very large university. It was Arizona State University. It's very large. And so someone that, like myself, who was very introverted and shy at the time, it was hard to know where to go. And so as a Latina and finding other folks that had similar journeys, I felt seen. And then it helped me also navigate what it meant to be a psychologist and a Latina psychologist and a woman of color. And that being visible is key. So being behind my closed doors and doing therapy isn't where it needs to be at all times. I need to be out there. I need to be kind of attending different club and organizational events, things like that. So it's seeing who I am, what I represent, and how it creates a safe pipeline for students to come into the center. And so I think I carry with me all those cultural values, and that's what I look for in a place of employment. Like, where can I create family wherever I go? And so those are strong values for me. Thank you, Jeanne.
Yes, that community. We need to find it wherever we are, because it is so, it's the air we breathe. And so
absolutely,
the community needs to see us, to affirm us, to help us, support us. And we will just keep on keeping on.
Let's keep on keeping on. Next slide. So what we wanted to do is many of the facets of what we've been discussing so far, and some of you may have seen this model presented before, amazing folks in the psychology field that generated this particular article. So if you haven't read it, please do. Toward a Psychological Framework of Radical Healing in Communities of Color. I've actually used this piece in a lot of the work I've been doing with my students. But what I want to do is break down kind of this model and why we talk about radical healing versus what we hear a lot about coping mechanisms. And so it's really talking about survival versus the thriving. So survival versus thriving. And so what I want to break down is just some of the systemic pieces, because when we talk about radical healing, why it's radical is because it's not a luxury. It's something we need, just like water to hydrate. We need to acknowledge that we need to take time for ourselves, but also understanding the systems that are operating around us and knowing where our power is. And so this particular model highlights particular areas you can see on your screen. And so I'll quickly go through this. And certainly if there's more dialogue after, feel free to reach out to us. But it really acknowledges the interlocking systems of oppression and hate. So if we look at institutional or systemic racism or other institutional or systemic oppression in any setting you may be in, whether it's at the more micro level or more larger levels, it's important for us to understand how that impacts us. So when we were talking about racial trauma, it's beyond just the notion of race or racial identity. It's the interconnection between and the relationship with the systems that we're operating in. And so it's understanding how privilege looks, it's understanding how power looks, who has authority and power to make decisions. It's looking at all those facets. So if you work in an educational system, if you work in something that's like a clinic, wherever you may be, you are a part of that system, but it may impact you differently than someone else. So if a person of color, and if we look at some of our students of color, let's say if they're in a predominantly, let's say, white Caucasian institution, their experience might look a bit different, where in other settings, it might be different, where they can see themselves reflected in the community. And so critical consciousness means we're aware of those situations, much like when I said, when I started at the counseling center, I was very aware. I was the only Latino psychologist there. I instantly felt some pressure internally that I needed to somehow meet the needs of the whole community on campus, which I knew realistically wasn't the case, but I felt it in my spirit. And I also knew that was part of the job description. And so I felt that I was going to be carrying a bit more of that weight. And then also seeing where does it look like with my counterparts in terms of how we're operating together. Part of the critical consciousness is also understanding our identities and honoring identities. So me as a Latina was kind of constantly, well, okay, what does it mean to be a psychologist? But what does it mean to be me and who I am culturally and my authenticity? And so that's the piece about understanding our identities and what they mean to us and all our multiple identities. So if you are part of the LGBTQ community, if you identify as an undocumented student or undocumented person, if you're a person of color, first gen, etc., understanding all your multiple identities make you who you are. So it's learning how to honor them and give them space. Strength and resistance, we've been talking about knowing your strengths, your internal gifts. Sometimes we tend to dim that light. We tend to kind of numb it down so we can fit in to what we feel the mold is. And what this particular model is saying is that we need to shine in these circumstances. But shining in those circumstances where we're feeling oppressed can be difficult. And so that's why we were talking about the emotional and social support, creating community, knowing your community, find those people that are your people. I say sometimes those are my people. Those are my people that get me, understand me. At the same time, we need to also feel inclusive of all spaces and creating that space. So radical hope is really radical because we don't want to lose hope for us to navigate. So to navigate a trial means we have to hold on to the authenticity of hope, that it's real, that it's there for us to take, but sometimes we need some support from other people to shine that light for us. So this is just reminding us back to the Audre Lorde quote, which I love that one, that self-care in particular is not self-indulgent. It is something that we need, it's self-preservation, and it's something that she talks about, it's an act of political warfare. When you hear act of political warfare, that tells us how radical it really is, because for our students that are doing a lot of social justice work, or they're really out there, they need to come back and replenish and re-heal to get back out there. So that's why it's so radical. Next slide.
So I just want to add, for those of you, whether you're a student or in a professional role, we want to encourage you to be leaders. Leaders heal and healers lead. So we need to build those healthy environments. And sometimes in order to build them, you have to be the leader. So if you can take that space, fill that space or encourage others to, that's what we're here for. So on this next slide, this is another um, one slide back, please. Let's see if we can go back. Okay. So in just thinking about this slide and the Dalai Lama, love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. And I think many of us have known that deep in our hearts, but sometimes it is hard to feel or see the humanity, especially in the last year and a half. But I hope today you are feeling some of the blessings of being in this moment together, and we hope that in some way we have added comfort and invited you into building community with us. And so now on to the next slide. We are just going to talk about and bring it home to some of the powerful acts of self-care, including acts of resistance. So Jessica and I will just go back and forth. And, we recognize that there's much brilliance out there. And so please, as we kind of name some of the things here, please add the things that have been helpful. Jessica, do you want to start?
Yes, definitely. So I was looking to see if anyone's going to add their own ideas. That'd be amazing. But what we started with yourself and with others. And so acts of resistance, comes in different shapes and forms. And so there's resistance within ourselves, meaning like that's where we were talking about boundaries, knowing when to say no, knowing when to ask yourself what you need, acknowledging those that you're grieving and what you said before in terms of remembrance. So acknowledging those that you're mourning. Permit yourselves not to have to stand up and fight for or be the one when you need to rest or protect yourself. So oftentimes folks may feel like they're the only person or the one person that feels they need to be out there being the advocate, being the one, whether it's protesting or the voice for a particular topic or experience in your workplace, or as students in particular, you might feel like you're that one voice that feels like you have to carry it all on your own. And we want you to ask yourself, what do you need, and knowing yourself, and if you need support from other people and creating that community. But we want you to also reclaim or claim how you identify. And so that's also a place of resistance. And I feel that's so powerful to really just say, this is who I am unapologetically. There's something so empowering about walking with that truth and walking in who you are. Empowering yourself in that education. And there's some folks in this space that just like, I feel like I don't have enough education. So empower yourself to just kind of learn or seek out opportunities like this, or seek out opportunities that might be on your campus or your respective sites, just to affirm that you're learning when we're all evolving. I think some folks that I've talked to before feel that, well, gosh, I feel like I'm behind, or maybe they don't have the buzzwords. They don't know what microaggressions are. That's okay. It's learning to listen, to understand, stretch your learning. It's okay. You don't have to have the verbiage or the language. Some of us might, and some of us might not. But it's learning to also be patient and flexible with ourselves. So I think that's also an act of resistance.
So I'll jump in here, and I was seeing on the chat a lot of people talking about prayer and blessings and feeling, a need to take care of their bodies. And so we have to add sleep.
Absolutely.
Journal, calling out to my friend there, the dancer and singer, the exerciser, to again practice all these things as they nourish you and as you need them. And we'll also talk about with yourself, that mindfulness that just allows you to sometimes ground yourself when there's too much going on out there. It can be very grounding just to take your own breath, to be in control of your own breath in your own space. And I often like to put, and I'm doing it right now, put my feet on the ground, the earth, or sometimes feel the sun and just take it all in. But we also know that we find our strength in self-care with others. So that solidarity through mentors and community that liberates you. You know, a saying that I remember, and it might be because of my roots being from places where it's warm, but we're using warm kind of in the metaphor. Go where it's warm, go where you're embraced. You know, find those
Absolutely.
environments, those structures and systems when you can, or ask that they be created. So you might have to protest and engage in advocacy. Again, we want to also acknowledge that you can permit yourself to not have to. I think
Hmm.
I saw a comment, sometimes you say yes, sometimes you say no.
That's right.
Sometimes you say yes to standing up and fighting for, and sometimes you say, no, this isn't my day. I'm not the one. I trust in my community that there will
Yes.
be others to represent me, to have great ideas, to have that energy when I might not. Speaking up for
Mm.
what you believe, changing policies. A lot of my time now is changing policies, whether that be at the state, community, you know, educational, institutional, or federal level, um, changing those policies. And one of the best things, and I'm doing it right now, I'm so thankful for you all sharing that gratitude, sharing
Yes.
that gratitude. It might, as Dr. Ortega mentioned, it might be over a meal, it might be in prayer, it might be in silence, and just knowing
Being.
that you are not alone. And that is why it's so important to have community. And I can't help but be touched by the Olympics right now. And so we know for a lot of
Oh.
students and maybe other people too, you know, through sports, through our teams, we have a community in our churches, in our
Hmm.
places of worship, in our student organizations, all those things. Those are the places where we can find powerful sense of self-care, including resilience and resistance.
I was going to add something, Gina, because I saw a few things in the chat. So these are amazing. You all are amazing, beautiful people. And I think the piece about knowing where the word yes and no resides in my body spoke to me, because I think when we were talking a little bit about oppression in any form or racial trauma, we store things in our body. And Dr. Manese was mentioning, I do a lot of body work and healing, and we store a lot of emotions in there. And so I find my navigation and liberation through expression of body and movement. And some people may not have the able-bodiedness in particular parts of their body, but I also feel the soul moves. And so I really appreciated hearing kind of that connection to the body. And Jeannie, you're mentioning just kind of to the earth, the things that are grounding to us, and spiritual to redirect ourselves. So thank you for those that shared so much. And so what we want to do is kind of bring it on home. This is an excerpt from Amanda Gorman for those that saw this amazing, amazing poet. We wanted to read a section of this dynamic and I feel liberating and hopeful poem. And so I'm going to read it and allow it to absorb as you need it to, and take it with you today. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. The new dawn balloons as we free it. For there's always light if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. Amanda Gorman. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortega. And so I believe that we have a few minutes. We are kind of scrolling through the chat and seeing if there are any questions that we might address, any more comments that we might want to end with. And so thank you all for your contributions to the chat.
Amazing. But any questions or reflections even?
So one question here is, as you return to the classroom, how do you create support from trauma? Well, I'm going to first of all shout out to the counseling centers on campuses. It is not necessarily the only place, but it is a place where professionals have decided that their career, their passion is helping others. And I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Ortega because we know that the community is really also important. And I would say, just in my own life, you know, being being in a housing situation where I found lifelong friends. You know, some were from my background, some were not from my same background, but we shared a caring about each other and we cared about change, positive change that was inclusive.
I think finding, I mean, the community, and we keep saying that word, is so key. And especially I'm looking at just that last comment about my hope is as the students go back to school, they find resources. And it's kind of learning what those resources are on campus. I was telling you a little bit, I didn't really know what my resources were because I went to a very large university. I know some colleges and universities are a little bit more intimate and smaller. And I know also if you're a shy person as a student or don't know how to navigate a system, like as a first gen, it can be difficult. So, you know, some of the resources I think of just my own campus is just knowing where that place could be. It could be, is it a starting point, the counseling center? Maybe that has a little bit of stigma for some folks. And is it the cross-cultural center or something like that? Something related to diversity. It could be your LGBT resource center. I work with a lot of campus agencies and departments that really focus in on your transfer students, because also we have to think of our transfer student and transition and adjustment, what that feels like for folks of color, because the expectation can be a little bit different.
And so our graduate students.
Absolutely. And then our grad students. And then in my campus, we have med students, law students, there's all kinds of amazing students, and then non-traditional age students, those that are parents. I've had many students that are parents and they're trying to navigate being a parent or a single parent and still having to manage things, food insecurities, and a lot of other things that are going on for our students. On our campus, we actually have something called the Fresh Basic Needs Hub. So they can go and get groceries or things like that that they can't afford. And so for all of us that might be in the position as, you know, maybe staff or if it's parents, you know, how to kind of ask for some of those resources. I know a lot of campuses have kind of your early orientation and they kind of throw a lot of stuff at you. But it's learning to kind of get connected to some of those support services and see, it's kind of trying on for size, which one feels safe. I know on our campus, we just started the last couple of years, it opened the Latinx Resource Center. We also have the Center for Black Cultures. And resources and research. And so it's learning how to see what the campus needs, what the students need, and trying to find some of those supports. I see a new question coming in there, Jeanne.
Well, let me refer to this comment. And I think, you know, one of these things, you know, just having these conversations on campus. So thank you for bringing that up. And, you know, whether it's in a forum, whether it's in a residence hall, whether you as a professional, you know, invite students in, invite the community in to have a conversation. I think conversations can build community. And for our parents out there that may be watching, I did want to share that when one of the nicest things, and my parents did so many things to sacrifice and make sure that as a first generation college student, I would be successful and supported. But one of the things they said is Jeannie, we didn't go to college. We don't know anything about college, but find someone there that knows you and can help you and can recognize that you were there to learn and support you. And so it really, in their own words, they were again talking about this mentorship. And we know that mentors aren't only our elders, but sometimes they're also our peers. So it might be that resident advisor. It might be, you know, someone your sports team. It might be the captain of the team. But finding those people that can show you the inside game, okay? And I
Yes.
don't mean to make out that it's all fun and games, or that college life is a game, but I mean it in the broader sense, is that it's not natural for everyone to just know, or maybe even anyone to know
Mm-hmm.
how to be successful as a student in a higher educational setting. And so there are certain ways, and you can find out from asking other students who are successful, going to your TA offices. And some TAs will be very supportive, and some you will never go back to. I remember that. But keep on keeping on and finding those professors and those people that are there to help you. And if you can't find any, turn to the Steve Fund, turn to
Yes.
us, turn back to your churches and your friends and your hometown, because I think it's also really important to think about, as a particularly what was always on my mind as I went and got different degrees is, will it change me? And it
Mm-hmm.
did change me, but I was so afraid of being something I didn't want to be. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to be someone that forgot where I came from, that forgot my roots,
Mm-hmm.
that forgot who I was, and forgot where my heart lies. And so, whether it was the students I was teaching, the clients I was counseling,
Mm-hmm.
the friends and colleagues I was working with, we all made an agreement that we were going to keep each other supported and
Mm-hmm.
authentic.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So I see the question. Do you have a recommended list of resources, organization, apps you recommend? Anything coming up for you, Jeannie?
Well, the Steve Fund for
Yeah,
one,
well, that's amazing. Yes, that's amazing.
and
Good.
going to your campus website,
Yeah,
it's amazing because we all, many of them have these orientations, and all this information goes in, and then it's like, whoa, I'm
so
in my
much.
junior year and now I know that there's a learning center. So going kind of weaving through that website, even though some of them, they could have done a better job, but on the other hand, weaving through there and seeing what you can see, and
Yes.
finding out what is there for you. We listed some resources and recommendations, and as I understand it, this PowerPoint and this presentation will be in the Steve Fund library, in the Steve Fund collection, so you can go back to this list, and you can go back to the many resources that it has.
And one thing I'll highlight is just because when we think of back to school, there's the logistics of school, just because some folks are kind of returning literally physically on campus. And so we're imagining, I know I've been talking to some of my other fellow therapists, psychologists, colleagues, and, some things could be exacerbated during this time of quarantining. It could be social anxiety of any kind, depression, increased isolation. They've had the increased isolation, but it looks different coming back on campus. If you're going back into living to residence halls, what does that look like to commune with people again? And so I do highlight the counseling center as a space for folks to really have that confidential time to unpack some of those feelings. Now, again, realizing some students may not feel it's a safe space yet. And that's why I think it's good to understand where some of those departments are, like you were saying, Dr. Manese, about where are some of these centers I can go to just kind of feel it out. So on our campus, it's called like the Cross-Cultural Center, and some other type of centers I said that were kind of more focused on particular identities on campus. And so wherever that student may be, I think it's very courageous to just make an appointment. I know for me, when I approach my work with my clients, one of the first questions, well, now doing Zoom, I just kind of say, hey, can you hear me? Because I know we get disconnected. But I'll ask, I said, is this your first time doing this? Is this the first time you've met with someone you don't know that has some, you think experience to help you through this? And so we kind of unpack what that might feel like in that setting, and remember we talked about trauma-informed care doesn't mean necessarily you've actually experienced trauma. For some it is, but it's also presenting a space of advocacy and safety and empowerment where they can feel like they can take the lead. And so I usually tell them, just, if you want to just try it out, see how it feels. Is there something you need to know about me and my background to make this a safe space for you? And so I do feel the counseling centers can be very helpful. I also think working in a counseling center, we get a lot of feedback from the community. So that's the other thing as students, if there's something on your campus that you feel is not seen or you need, I encourage you to, whether it be the counseling center or know kind of how the layout is. That's why I think organizationally, it's really good to understand the system that you're learning in. And so that's why it's good to have support so you don't have to handle it all by yourself. And know that your feedback does matter. I know we've started groups sometimes because it was a need for our students. So just know that you have a voice too.
So with that, we are coming to an end of our hour. And again, we want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. Stay connected and reach out and to share additional opportunities to connect and learn. Jessica and I will say thank you. And
gracias.
Goodbye, and we will turn it over to Laura Sanchez Parkinson, Director of Programs and Partnerships for the Steve Fund.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manese and Dr. Ortega. And on behalf of the Steve Fund, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and attending this event today. If you would like to continue to engage with the Steve Fund, we welcome you to visit our website to learn more about our programs, services, and resources. And I'm also going to put in the chat box, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, for you to receive our monthly updates. We invite you to join us again next month for our community conversations, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Have a blessed day.
Bye.
I give the power to the people, everybody would be equal. Fight Club would have a sequel, and my rent would be much cheaper. Jenny wouldn't hate her figure when she's small or when she's bigger. She'd be kissing on the mirror, and the Wi-Fi would be quicker. Everybody would recycle, fewer cars and more bicycles. No more fighting for survival. You would hear this song on vinyl. If I rule the world, if I rule the world, rule the world, rule the world. If I rule the world, if I rule the world, rule the world, rule the world. You'd see a doctor if you're sick. Mary, don't you worry about it, 'cause there'd be no bill. No more $1,000 pills, and age would be a source of pride. You've got beautiful laugh lines. 9 to 5 includes your nap time, and there'd be TED Talks at halftime. All the sexist, racist bandits would be sent off for rehabbing, and instead of feeding fear, we'd be feeding half the planet. Damn it! If I rule the world. Less about me, more about you. If I ruled, it would be less about me, more about you. More about you. We'd be kind to refugees, plant more trees in inner cities. We'd bus kids to see the ocean. Some kids never see the ocean. I'd make news more beneficial. I'd make every driver signal. Only love is my objective. Only love is my perspective. I'd keep music